There are fairies on the farm.
My award-winning fairy fantasy novel, The Ghost of Nothing, is available now in paperback, hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, so be sure to check it out. It was evening in winter. I was walking the dog. It was really cold and crisp, dry winter air, not damp. Frost had started to form. I had let the dog off the lead, and he had trotted on ahead up the drive to the house, when suddenly I had the feeling of being rushed at very fast. I realized there was someone just behind me at my right shoulder. He pushed past me, and I felt myself physically bumped on my right side. A man swept past me. As he moved, he turned to look at me, almost snarled, and then was gone. He just vanished, leaving me standing there in surprise, trying to figure out what I'd just seen and felt. The man was thin, about 5'5", long-limbed. He was dressed in early Victorian dress, with a crooked stovepipe hat, a check muffler, and a tatty jacket, with checkered trousers and boots. But what I remember most was his face, which was long and angular. He was aged with white hair and sharp features, and he had long fingers, long nails, a long nose, and very bright eyes. But it wasn't a kind face. It was pinched, and while not evil, it definitely wasn't kind. It didn't feel like a haunting, but more like an encounter with the Fae or something very elemental, something ancient. Whatever it definitely was not of this world. My father, now deceased, was born in England, Lancashire, in 1937. Growing up, he used to tell us a story about the time he saw the Boggart. He swore up and down that it was a true story. It's possible he wrote it down in his memoirs, but unfortunately I can't access those right now, so I can only tell the story based on what I remember him telling me. He was larking about on the moor with some friends, I guess they were all somewhere between 9 and 13, when they were confronted by what he described as a small man. The man was about 3 or 4 feet high, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a tattered coat, boots caked in mud, and his face shadowed beneath a too-tall hat. They all immediately and simultaneously fled in terror, vaulting high hedges in their path until they were too exhausted to run any further. Decades later, he still believed this to have been a Boggart, and was quite serious in his recollection of it, like he could still remember how scared they all were by the encounter. Naturally, the rest of us in the family think of it as an amusing tale of our ancestral homeland. He did have a few good ghost stories in his repertoire, but that story always stood out to me. I often wonder if my father really did see a Boggart or some other fairy creature out there on the moor, and if this means there's a whole hidden world running parallel to ours that occasionally lets itself be seen. I found your channel a few weeks ago and have been ardently listening to the stories you read. Your channel made me start wondering if what happened to me was possibly a fairy of some kind. This happened to me and my husband about 4 years ago. My husband and I moved into a basement apartment to fit our growing family while we saved up money for a home. I was super pregnant with my second at the time and overheated fast. One night, I asked my husband if we could sleep with the window open on a particularly pleasant night. With the window open, I soon fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, a creaking noise woke me up. I looked around in the dark and noticed our bedroom door opening slightly and then closing again, as if the wind was pushing it and sucking it back in. But the curtains at the window were still untouched by the wind, and I didn't feel a breeze, so I thought it was a bit strange. I remained in bed watching the door. Then I realized there was something there, just between the door and the frame, all in shadow. I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like a small girl, the height of a 2-year-old child. My daughter was 2 years old at the time, so I assumed it was her. It was unusual, though. My daughter had been sleeping in a toddler bed for several months at this point, but she had yet to get out of her bed at night. If she ever did wake up in the middle of the night, she usually called to us while she was still in her bed, as she was afraid to walk around at night by herself. Even now, at 7, she hates getting out of bed at night. The door opened slightly again. The figure in the shadows was hesitating to come in, and thinking it was my daughter, I said, "It's okay, you can come in," or something along those lines. As I said this, the door opened wider, and the figure started to step forward, still hesitating with her hand on the door. She was still in shadow, and I couldn't really make out her face clearly. Her hair was like my daughter's, but she wasn't wearing what I had put her to bed in. She was wearing a white nightgown-looking outfit, old-fashioned looking. I spoke again that it was okay to come in, but this time I spoke my daughter's name. As soon as I did, the girl frowned and stepped away from the room and then out of sight. She didn't disappear. It was more like she backed away, still looking at me, until she was out of sight and I couldn't see her anymore. My husband had woken up with the noise of the door as well and saw the girl. When the figure walked away from our room, he got up to check on our daughter. We thought she would be right on the other side of the door since we were both pretty convinced that that had been her, but no one was there. So he walked back to my daughter's room, which was across the apartment, and he found her there, sound asleep in bed. I didn't believe this when my husband told me, so I went to check on her as well. And she was there in bed in a deep sleep. A 2-year-old couldn't fake sleeping, and my daughter has a very specific breathing pattern when she sleeps. She also was still wearing the PJs I had put her in. She has never walked in her sleep. I know that sleepwalking can happen as a one-time thing, but if it was her and she was sleepwalking, there was no way she could have gotten from our bedroom door to her bed with the blankets on in the time it took my husband to check on her. So what did we see? Our brains trying to rationalize what happened allowed us to go to sleep without really talking about it. But in the morning, when we both woke, I brought up the door moving last night, and my husband described what he had seen in the shadows through the opening of the door. He described the exact figure I had seen, even down to the frown and the hesitant actions. I still don't know what we saw. A ghost? Something else? I've tried to explain this rationally, but I can't. Sure, the wind could have moved the door, but there was no wind, and the door didn't move like it was being pushed by the wind. And even if it was the wind, how can that explain the figure that both I and my husband saw? Whatever it was, there was a hopefulness and timidness when I spoke and invited the figure in. And I felt a disappointment from her when I spoke my daughter's name, as if she thought I was calling to her at first. I know I didn't imagine this or dream it since my husband saw it too. He described exactly what I had seen without me saying anything. That tells me it was real. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't said my daughter's name, if instead I'd invited the figure in one more time. I was homeschooled most of my life. We lived in this old 18th century house, one of those places where the floors creak even when no one's walking on them. We had this fireplace in the dining room that always made me uneasy. We hardly ever used it, but still, it was this deep soot-stained thing with an iron grate that was ice cold to the touch, no matter the season. I remember one afternoon during a history lesson, I was sitting at the table facing that fireplace. I was supposed to be paying attention, but I kept getting distracted, doodling in the margins of my notebook. Something about that day felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had this low-level sense of nervousness, like when you know someone's watching you, even if you can't see them. I remember feeling like that, kind of on edge, when I felt something brush against my leg. At first, I figured it was just our cat weaving around the chair, so I ignored it. But the feeling didn't stop. It changed into this sharp electrical tugging, like something was pulling at me. I jerked backward and looked under the table, expecting to see the cat. And yeah, the cat was there, but she wasn't near me. She was at the other end of the table, curled up in the ball, sleeping. That's when I noticed that beyond her, inside the fireplace, there was this shadow. Not like a trick of the light, it had a shape. It seemed to be the silhouette of a small boy wearing a cap and what looked like old-fashioned overalls. He had this strange dim glow around him, a yellowish orange kind of light, almost like firelight. But the fireplace itself wasn't lit. I was still half convinced that this was some kind of trick of the light, but then I noticed the figure was moving, sort of tiptoeing, sneaking like he was trying not to be seen. I sat there watching as this dark figure crept from one side of the fireplace to the other. No one else in my family seemed to notice. They kept talking like nothing was happening, like there wasn't a shadow boy-shaped thing moving through the fireplace right in front of me. And then he was gone. The glow vanished. The room felt normal again. Ever since that day, I've kept an eye on the shadows, wondering if I might see something like that again. The house is very old, so I have to wonder about its history. I'm not entirely sure what it was. I guess it could have been a ghost, but the idea of a fairy did cross my mind. The boy in the fireplace felt misplaced, whatever it was, like he'd stepped out of a different time. And the way he moved, sneaking, hiding, like he was passing through but didn't want to be seen, made me think possibly he could have been a fairy. From my research, I know there are stories that say that fairies are sometimes attracted to human homes, especially the fireplaces. So I think it's a possibility. I must have been about 6 or 7, maybe a little older. I was in bed trying to fall asleep, curled up on my left side. The room was dark except for the thin strip of golden light seeping in from the hallway under my door. Everything was quiet, still. It was then that I glanced down at my blanket, which was crumpled over my right hip, and I saw this tiny man, no more than 8 or 10 inches tall, sitting right there on top of the blanket, staring at me. He looked old, very old, his beard and hair both long and gray. He didn't look threatening, but he wasn't exactly friendly either, just watching, like he was observing something he was curious about. I didn't move. I don't remember feeling his weight or movement, but I knew he was there. The details of his clothing were hard to make out in the dim light, but they looked old, really old. His hat was pointed but soft, flopped over to one side. and his clothes were old-fashioned, like from the 1800s or even earlier. He wasn't wearing a coat or jacket, just simple worn fabric. He started to move. I don't know what he was about to do, but I was so scared I yanked the blanket over my head and lay there for a while, listening, waiting. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out again, he was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night, but judging by his size, my assumption is that he was some kind of fairy. I think I wasn't supposed to see him, but I did. And I still wonder if, when I'm asleep, maybe when we're all asleep, there are things in the dark watching us. It was a really pleasant late summer's day. Sunny, but not too hot or humid. My wife and I decided to drive to a water park in Greater Manchester to take a walk and have a coffee in a nice setting. The water park has a building and facilities and good parking, but is surrounded by farmed fields, easy paths, a few clusters of trees, and to one side the Mersey River. Away from the water activities, it's a very tranquil setting with interesting bird life. We were walking along a slightly elevated path between two fields, which were cultivated with well-developed cereal crops. The water park was well behind us, and to the fore, open countryside in a semi-rural setting. At 90 degrees to the main path, much lesser paths occasionally cut through the crop. At one such lesser path, walking out of the crop, but parallel with myself, at a distance of about 10 meters, was a fairy. He was more purposeful than myself, crossed the minor path, and went back into the crop and out of sight. Though I only saw him for a moment, my impression was clear. He was about 2 to 3 foot tall, tanned and weathered, balding, aged about 60 to my impression, with a serious aspect and dressed as a Victorian farmer might be, in a dark brown jacket, waistcoat, short boots, and trousers gathered at the knee. He was not as I expected a fairy to be at all, and yet I was certain that that was what he was. He looked like a 3-foot tall Victorian farmer. Later, reading suggested he might be an earth elemental. I think fairies are a different class of being, close to our world, but not of it. I think there are many different types of them, and the type I saw was connected to the earth. Years later, I met the queen of fairies in a dream and paid homage to her. She showed me the house on the seafront which I was to live in the future. I had never been there before, and a glimpse of the fairy activity on the promenade, which was bonkers. I've never forgotten that dream, or the sighting of the fairy in the field. This happened in the 1970s. I was about 12 at the time, staying in a room with my same-aged cousin at my aunt's house in Northumberland. Although the lights were off, the room was lit by the streetlight directly outside the bedroom. My cousin had gone to sleep, and I turned over to do the same when something caught my eye. It was a small creature dressed as an old-fashioned soldier in a scarlet uniform. He was walking in front of the heater, which had a red light on it, with a tiny musket on his shoulder. He literally marched backward and forward in front of the heater. He lit up each time he walked in front of the streetlight, although he was still visible away from it. I knew immediately I was seeing a fairy. I remember sharing my experience a few weeks later when I was back at school in London, and my fellow pupils laughed me out of the classroom. I never mentioned it again after that. I still find it hard to talk about these things as people immediately laugh you down. I do believe in nature spirits, but I think the being I saw was a fairy because of his size. I just assumed it was a fairy, but I suppose it could have been something else. Whatever it was, and whatever people might think, I know it happened. I know what I saw. This happened in Finland in the 1950s. My late aunt had a gift. She could see things other people couldn't. Fairies, gnomes, spirits of the land. One day when she was a young girl, I'm not sure exactly her age, she was hiking with her family through the forest. As they walked, she happened to glance into an old tree stump, and inside it was a tiny old man smiling up at her through the hollow. His face was wrinkled but kind, and he held a long curved pipe between his fingers. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from centuries ago, worn but well kept, as if he had stepped out of another time. She knew right away that he was the spirit of the tree, still lingering even though the trunk had been cut down a long time ago. She didn't feel afraid, but she didn't want to bother him either or make a fuss, so she looked away and continued her hike. I always wonder what she really saw that day, if it was just a trick of the light or something more. But if fairies and spirits do exist, maybe they've always been here, living alongside us unseen. I like the idea, and I'm willing to consider that it might be true, but I don't know what I'd do if I ever met one myself. Thanks for watching, and thank you to everyone who submitted their stories for this one. One thing I've noticed after narrating so many of these stories now is that when fairies are sighted, they are often seen in old-fashioned style clothing, which is why I was excited to put this collection together. I think this could explain their connection with ghosts in some cultures because of the sense that they've stepped out of a different time. It could be that time runs differently in their world or reality. It could also be that they just prefer older fashions. Let me know your theories in the comments for why fairies are often seen in these older styles of clothing. I know that this is definitely something I've explored in my own work. In fact, one of my characters I specifically described as looking like a parody of a Victorian gentleman. Speaking of my work, if you haven't yet, be sure to pick up a copy of my fairy fantasy novel, The Ghosts of Nothing. It's a spooky supernatural story about a girl living in a haunted town with more than just ghosts lurking in the shadows. The book has won some awards, including being a finalist in the Independent Author Association's Best Book of the Year award, and I'm so grateful for the wonderful reviews that it's been getting. If you enjoy this channel and the spooky magical vibe, you'll definitely want to check it out. It dives deeper into those kind of eerie sensations that you'll get from this channel, and I just really think you'll enjoy it. For a chance to win a free copy of the audiobook, be sure to subscribe to Fairy Lights, my fairy newsletter, or alternatively, my writing newsletter, The Shaken Tree, or you can sign up for both. I'm giving away one free copy each month of my audiobook to one newsletter subscriber, and it's completely free to join. You'll find the sign up link on my website and in the description below. Do you have a story of your own to share? I'd love to hear it. Head over to scaryfairygodmother.com where you can submit your stories using the form there on the website. A huge heartfelt thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon, as well as to anyone who joined the channel, made a one-time donation through PayPal or Coffee, or subscribed to the paid version of the newsletter. Your support means the world to me and helps keep this work going. If you'd like to lend your support, you'll find all the support options in the description below. The stories in this video came from subscribers and the Fairy Census, so a big thanks to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited for dramatic reasons, but to read the full census stories, follow the link in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to hit the bell to be notified when a new video drops. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.